We've come now to have a look at the European Union and what Bible prophecy requires concerning it. Of course, it behoves me, making such a statement as that, to give you the scriptural evidence that that is actually what will happen. And so our purpose this morning is to lay before you those scriptures. So you're going to see a little bit more of scripture than we've been able to do in our sessions thus far, because we're going to have a look at Revelation 13 and a bit of 17 and back to Daniel chapter 7 as time permits this morning. So we are in a situation now where we're watching, as we saw yesterday, dramatic developments. And 2016 and 17 have certainly seen dramatic developments for Europe. We know, of course, that Britain left Europe in 2016, and that has had consequences for the European Union, as we shall see. Well, let's start with the simple and the straightforward in this subject of Europe and the great confederacy that will include portions of Europe when Gog comes down upon the land. And the first thing we need to understand is that Bible prophecy requires that the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream should stand complete in the latter days. Now, you may recall the quotation from Brother Maurice Stewart yesterday that a power must arise which will collect together the peoples who inhabit the territories of those four world empires. Okay, so that's fundamental. The development of this great confederacy is going to include all peoples who live in the territories of those four empires, excluding Britain, and you're going to see the reason why we should exclude Britain as we proceed here this morning. So when you come to Daniel chapter 2 and verses 28 and 35, there are very clear statements made about that. You'll notice in the green on the screen that at the end of verse 28, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that he was going to be informed by the interpretation of this dream of what shall be in the latter days. We're living in the latter days. And then in verse 35 we read that the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver and the gold were to be broken to pieces together. And as Brother Maury pointed out, you can't break something together unless they are together. They've all got to be there at that time in order to be broken to pieces together. So that's a very fundamental thing. And of course the drama of Daniel chapter 2 is that when this image power does finally stand up, and it won't stand up, brothers and sisters and young people, until Gog is victorious over all comers in the land of Israel. Daniel chapter 11 says that they will plant the tent or tabernacle of their power between the seas in my glorious holy mountain. And so this image just stands up in all its glory, and the stone power smites it on the feet, and over it goes. In the next 40 years it grinds it to powder. That's the drama of Daniel chapter 2. We're watching the collection of the nations who belong to that image, but they're not going to stand up together until they're in the land of Israel, because Israel was one of the important parts of all four empires, wasn't it? And until they get it, it's not complete. So there is what Daniel 2 is teaching us about the future, which is not very far away. Now this is brought out, of course, by Brother Thomas when he wrote what we now call the exposition of Daniel. He said this about Nebuchadnezzar's image yet to stand. This scene, he says, has never been exhibited before the eyes of the world, because the constituents of the Colossus have never yet been put together so as to form the image of the scene. So it's still yet to come. We're expecting, of course, that to soon come, because what we're watching is these developments. Now we know, of course, that Nebuchadnezzar's image, because it must stand the latter days, will have one way of thinking. It's going to have a Babylonian head. It's a papal way of thinking. Okay, so that's obvious from that head. And then we have to have a Western leg with political clout. So the papacy in the West has to have restored to him some real political clout in Europe. We're going to talk about that this morning. And then, of course, as we pointed out yesterday, we're going to have Gog in control of Constantinople, and that will be the eastern leg. And because, of course, the religion of the West and the religion of the East came from the same source, they're all Catholic, really, okay, they will have this one way of thinking because there will be an agreement between Gog and the papacy. So that's what we're expecting, brothers and sisters, and we're watching it develop right now. But what about Britain's part? in all of this. Of course, Britain was a member of the Roman Empire from the times of Julius Caesar. So he conquered, I believe, Britain, and of course, for hundreds of years, Britain was under the control of the Roman Empire. So what happened when Britain ceased to become part of the Roman Empire? Well, this is what happened. In 420 AD, the Roman Empire was finally resolved into two legs. It had gone through many iterations in its history. There were times when it was 2 and times when it was 3. In times of Diocletian it was 4. They had 4 emperors and so on. It was not until 420 AD that we finally got 2 legs. When that happened, Britain was no longer part of the Roman Empire. Okay, so what we have here, of course, in these legs and the feet that are being formed, as Brother Thomas points out, they have not yet been formed. They are being formed because what is required is a fusion of iron, and the only remnant of the Roman Empire that we've had in recent times is its religion, Catholicism. It's a fusion of iron with clay that represents, of course, the democratic peoples of Europe. So when you read Daniel 2, which we're not going to go into now, when you read Daniel 2 verses 41 to 43, this is what becomes clear, brothers and sisters and young people. It is the iron that takes the initiative to infuse itself with the clay. It's not the other way around. Historically, it was the clay of the barbarian powers that came in and infused themselves into the iron of the empire. But this is clear from chapter 2 verses 41 and 43. It's the iron of Catholicism that takes the initiative, which is why this current Pope is ideal for the job. Okay, whether he will remain very long, only time will tell, but he's ideal for the job because, of course, he's espousing or mouthing very humanistic approaches to things, acceptance of homosexuals and all that kind of stuff, okay, which, of course, the European nations have got ears, they're wide open, see. The last couple of popes were strict, doctrinaire Catholics and made it difficult for the Pope to achieve any real progress in Europe. But that's another subject. We're talking about Britain's relationship to Rome. So these feet, with the 10 toes, is a confederation of European states united for a time by Gog. But it is a brittle fusion of democracy and false religion. So when did the Romans leave Britain? Well, we know that Britain is clearly the Tarshish of Ezekiel 38 verse 13. That can be proven by history and by scripture. We know that Britain, with its young lions, will oppose Gog's invasion of the land after Sheba and Dedan. And we know, brothers and sisters, that America is not a young lion. Now, when I make this statement in America, the rotten tomatoes start being thrown from the audience. I've had people walk out on me. What they don't realise, sadly, is that our Christadelphian community, from the 1850s right down to the 1950s, in fact 1957, never believed and never taught that America was a young lion. Did you know that? I can actually give you all the proof of that. Our community for over 100 years taught that America was not a young lion. And yet we've got off the track on that matter because, of course, we look at America and, oh, there's the most powerful nation on earth. They must have a place in the divine program. Brother Thomas says, both in Eureka and in the Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come in 1860, when he was asked by a sister, what part does America play in Bible prophecy? This is what he said in a 4-page article, first paragraph. He said, there are no prophecies concerning the United States of America in the Bible as there are for Britain, for Russia, for Germany, etc. And he nominates it. See? So our community never believed that the US had any role to play in the latter-day fulfilment of Bible prophecy. And history will repeat itself, just like America didn't go into the First World War until very late in the piece, just like in the Second World War when they stayed out and would have stayed out if the Japanese hadn't bombed Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, they would have stayed out of the Second World War. Okay? They were not interested, they were internalised. They had the spirit of a man called Donald Trump. You know what his spirit is? America first and the rest of you can jump in the lake. Okay, that was their attitude. We don't care about it. We don't want to get involved in European wars. And they stayed out until, of course, they got punched in the nose. And then it was different. So history will repeat itself. When the events of Armageddon come along, because of the Great Depression that's coming, America will be the nation that suffers the worst in that depression, and they will not be interested. They'll be interested only in one thing, their own recovery. Who cares about what Russia's doing in the Middle East? Okay, so that is what we expect, based on not only history, but upon what the scriptures say. Because they're silent about the US in Bible prophecy. They're not silent about Canada, okay? And they're not silent about Australia, because we are definitely young lions. So what's a lion represent in Scripture? Well, we're told this. The very first time you read about a lion in the Word of God is in Genesis 49, verses 9 and 10, which some of you probably can't see. It's on the bottom corner of that slide. In Genesis 49, we read that Judah is a lion's whelp, and the sceptre shall not depart from Judah. This is where we get the lion of the tribe of Judah of Revelation chapter 5 and verse 5 from, isn't it? He's the lion of the tribe. What's that about? It's about Christ's government, isn't it? A lion represents government. And if you don't have a British form of government, then you're not a young lion. And America doesn't have a British form of government. Okay? So when you come to this First World War poster, you see helped by the young lions, the old lion defies his foes, Australia, Canada, India and New Zealand. And Brother Wayne pointed out to me that he had seen the picture that I have seen, which I should have put up on the screen, of the Punch magazine in 1923. And there was the old lion sitting at the table with all of the young lions around it. And there was Australia and Canada and New Zealand and India and South Africa they had in the picture, and they also had Newfoundland. Okay? Which was part of the British Empire, I think, at one point. So I don't think the people at Newfoundland would have realised that, but they were a young lion. But it didn't have the United States of America. So even the world recognised that America wasn't a young lion. By the way, if you want the evidence, I can give you a heap of it, a mountain of it, which you can consider in your own time. So, who are the young lions? Well, you saw them on the screen, didn't you? I want to come then to the fact that Britain, that was withdrawn from the Roman Empire, because the Romans came out in 410 AD, okay, that's when they left Britain. We didn't get our two legs until 420 AD. So when we got the two legs, Britain was no longer part of the Roman Empire. It has no part to play in Europe. So I want to just very quickly review what happened and what is happening in relation to Britain and Europe. Of course, there's that wonderful date, 23rd of June 2016, which we spoke of yesterday, when the British people voted against the odds by divine intervention to leave the European Union. Another important date occurred this year. It was the 29th of March 2017 when Theresa May, on behalf of the British government, signed Article 50 of the European Union's Constitution. By that, of course, the British made it very clear that they were leaving Europe. And there's no turning back from that. Once you sign that, you have 2 years to get out. They've got a big job in front of them, because Britain, of course, is governed by at least 36,000 pieces of legislation from the European Parliament passed from the time that they joined in 1973. Now, what are you going to do with 36,000 pieces of legislation, much of which you don't like? This is the reason they came out. Well, you can't sift through that in 2 years, so they're just going to pick it up and bring it into British law, pass and say, let's just take the whole lump and then we'll sort that out later. Okay, and they'll sift through it and accept what they think is good and reject what they think is bad. So it's a huge task, but it's begun. They've already started on that road. And while there may be talk of, another referendum, forget it. You know why we can forget it? Well, because God was involved in them leaving. He's not going to let them go back. They are out and they will stay out. 8th of June 2017 is another important date, because that's the date when hubris overtook the British Prime Minister, who had a majority of 17 in the Parliament, and thought that the character of the times would allow her to go to the electorate 3 years early, didn't have to go until 2020, and she would get a bigger majority. It would make her task in negotiating the exit from Europe much easier. God had different ideas. The populace was sick to death of elections for a start, and so when she went to the people on the 8th of June, she got a clout, all right, a punch in the nose, so to speak, politically, because the British people said no, and they voted for that unusual gentleman who's the leader of the Labor Party in a way that she could never have anticipated, and not even he anticipated it. Okay. So why did that happen, do you think? What's that about? Does this have a part in the divine plan? Well, yes, it does. Because you see now, Theresa May, for the next 3 years, until the next election, is dependent upon a very small Northern Ireland party. She would depend on the anti-Catholic Northern Ireland Democratic Unionist Party, formed by so-called Reverend Ian Paisley. And of course she's also dependent on some Scottish Conservatives. So who are these Democratic Unionist people? Well, they are followers of Ian Paisley. He's long since dead, of course, but on the website, which is still there, you can go and have a look at their website. His public relations arm is called the European Institute of Protestant Studies. They say that their purpose is to expound the Bible. They could probably do a better job with that. Expose the papacy, to be frank, they do a little better than we do in some ways, and to promote, defend and maintain Bible Protestantism in Europe and further afield. Okay, so this is the whole purpose of Paisley's party that still exists and which Theresa May is now dependent on. When Princess Margaret, long since dead, of course she died of lung cancer or whatever it was, she was a smoker, and the Queen Mother met Pope John the 23rd in 1958, Paisley condemned them for committing spiritual fornication and adultery with the Antichrist. Haven't heard too much language like that from us. And in 1988, Paisley interrupted a speech being delivered by the popular Pope John Paul II in the European Parliament. He was a member of that Parliament. And he stood up and shouted to the Pope, "I denounce you as the Antichrist." Really? Okay, so you get a bit of a feel for where this party is coming from. So you just imagine if you're Theresa May and you've got to go into negotiations with the Catholic nations of Europe who are saying to you, well, look, I know we've got to have a divorce, but let's just keep sort of cuddling up together. What do you reckon the DUP's going to do? Okay. So you see what God's done? He's tied her hands. She thought she'd get this massive majority to be able to get basically a soft exit and get all the things that Britain wants. God wants Britain out. All right? He wants them cut off from Europe. That's how he operates, brothers and sisters, and that happened in 2017. Marvellous things, isn't it? Marvellous the way the hand of God works in human affairs. He could bring great storms on the 23rd of June. You know where those storms came from? They never come from there. They always come from the Atlantic, usually. I mean, it's rare for huge storms that drop, abundant rain on London. They don't come from Europe. You know where they came from? Brussels. Brussels is the headquarters of the European Union. That's the way the angels work. Okay, so we've been watching the divine hand in human affairs. Now, I'm not going to read all of that. All I want here is that Britain has now agreed to pay $78 billion for the divorce payment from the European Union. So that's, it's a heavy price, isn't it? But they have to pay it, and they will pay it, and they'll get out, and they'll be out at the return of Christ. They'll be the Tarshish of Ezekiel 38 and verse 13. So what about the European Union? Well, I picked this particular article from the Globe and Mail, which is a Toronto paper, in, as you can see, March 2016. And I found this very interesting because even back that far, nearly 2 years ago, this is what was happening to the European Union. Now, you've had time to look at this. You see this here, this is a knitting thread that's unravelling. So this is some lady's knitting of the European Union as it is or was in March 2016, and someone's pulled a knitting needle out. And it's unravelling. Okay, you know what happens if you do knitting, you know what happens. If you pull the knitting needle out, it starts to unravel. And it's unravelling because of financial stress, a bit more about that in a minute, internecine strife, bankrupt member states, and most of the southern states here, including Ireland, are bankrupt or pretty close to it. They've had to be bailed out, many of them, mainly by Germany, that's now in serious financial trouble because of that. Okay, by the inclusion of the refugees from the Middle East. Did you hear that anti-Semitism is on the sharp rise in Germany? Why would that be? Well, they've just taken in 1 million Syrians who don't like Israel. Of course you're going to have a rise in anti-Semitism. And they will join with the neo-Nazis that are making progress in Germany and got, their right-wing party got far more votes than Merkel thought they could possibly get, okay? And that's why she can't form a government right now. So there's a whole heap of issues going on in Europe, and Germany is in deep trouble. They opened their borders and now they've got to pay the price for that. So all of these things are contributing, and of course the removal of Britain from their ranks, which was one of the most important states in the European Union, one of the most wealthy states, that has been a huge blow for the European Union. So it is unravelling, no question about that. So what does Bible prophecy require? So this is where I'm going to take you to the scriptures, and we're going to have a look and see exactly what Bible prophecy requires at the time of Armageddon and beyond. And it's very clear, the message is very clear. So we want to try and put some detail on this, and we want to give you the proof that the European Union as we know it must disintegrate and another union form in the likeness of the past, as you're going to see. So Revelation 17, verses 12 and 13, we might want to come along to Revelation 17 because shortly I'm going to take you to chapter 13. Revelation 17. Now we know that this chapter contains, of course, the imagery of the great whore, and we can prove that that's the Roman Catholic system because we know from the last verse that this was the system that came from Rome, the place that ruled the world, the city that ruled the world. It tells you where it's from. So this is the system of Roman Catholicism and its latter-day form. It's very interesting because its latter-day form takes the character of its form in the past described in chapter 13 in the beast of the sea. So we'll get to that. We'll step you through that. But what does this tell us? Revelation 17 verses 12 and 13. Well, it tells us at the end of the days, and we know it's the end of the days because if you just have a quick look at verse 14, you read these horns that these kings that we're going to talk about in a second, that's the context. These kings, it says, shall make war with the Lamb, with Christ. And the Lamb shall overcome them because he's King of Kings, etc. So we know that this is about Armageddon and beyond. It's about the conflict that is looming up upon us. Okay, so it's latter day when we read, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now, we don't have time to stop and pause there, but Brother Thomas says, quite correctly, that every time that you read the term hour in the book of Revelation, except for chapter 9 and verse 15, because it's different, it's couched differently, every time you read this word hour, it refers to 30 years. And you can prove that. You can prove it both by the formula that God uses and by history. If you go to Revelation 8 verse 1 and Revelation 11 verse 13, you have your historical proof that it's actually 30 years. Now, I haven't got time to do that now, of course, but if you want to come and have a chat to me, I'll run you through that. And we clearly demonstrate that it's a reference to 30 years. So when you read that they receive power as kings 1 hour, it means 30 years. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. So what's it telling us? There will be 10 independent nations with one political agenda shaped and guided by the papacy, who at that time will have great power. Now the Pope's going to get that power, brothers and sisters and young people, on the back of the Great Depression that's coming, while you and I are at Sinai, going through the process of judgment and preparation for our work of the future. Okay? That's when he's going to get that power. And it will be enormous, because those European nations, the southern European nations that this is about, are going to be dependent. They are already bankrupt, leave alone what's going to happen to them when the Great Depression comes. So they're going to need the Pope, big time. And he's not going to give any help, is he, without a quid pro quo. What do you think the quid pro quo might be? I want to say in your politics, okay? I want to say in your politics. And so the iron will mingle itself with the clay, and there'll be a brittle fusion. They don't really agree, do they? So they don't hang together all that well, but they'll hang together long enough for that image to stand up on those feet and to stand up in the land of Israel and to be crushed by Christ and the saints. So that's what this is about. The European Union, the Eurozone, therefore, is doomed as we know it. And the British withdrawal, and as I said, the bankruptcy that is creeping through all of those southern nations is going to finish the job. And the northern nations, who are, relatively speaking, more prosperous than the southern ones, are going to hive off and do their own thing for their own preservation. They're not going to go down the gurgler with the southern nations, because that's what's happening to Germany. All this money going out to save Greece and to save Spain and to save Portugal and save Ireland and to save Italy, which is nearly bankrupt. Can't keep doing that, can they? So they're going to hive off for their own salvation in the end. So chapter 17 is about the fate of the harlot system. And John, in verse 1, is invited to come hither, or as the words are in the Greek, literally, come along, come on, come along. He's invited to be personally involved in the judgments of the great whore, the Catholic harlot, who sits upon many waters, the multitudes of verse 15, peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And we know from, as I said, the last verse, this is clearly about Rome. And of course, we read about 7 hills as well. If you go back to verse 10, verses 9 and 10, you can see that Rome was built upon 7 hills. So there's a lot of identifications here. So when you come and have a look at the Roman Empire as it was at its height, so here it is, this is the basic boundaries of the Roman Empire at its height. Then you see this woman sitting astride it, but you see this prophecy is about the latter days. What we had in history has got to come back, okay? And therefore we've got to see why and how. So this is the latter day manifestation of the beast of the sea of chapter 13. A revival of papal political power, following, of course, the devastation that occurred during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars to the Catholic system. Now that's the subject of verse 16 of Revelation 17. Verse 16 is actually telling us that there would be a hiccup. Papal power would receive a huge blow, and it did in the events of the French Revolution. Verse 16 says, "And the 10 horns," these are the nations formed by the barbarians when they broke up the Roman Empire, "the 10 horns," it says, "which thou sawest," and it says upon the beast, it should read "and the beast," "these shall hate the whore," the Catholic system, "and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire." They did that, didn't they, from 1789 right through into the 1800s. They made life intolerable. The Pope was exiled in 1809. He didn't have a home, basically. He was a prisoner of Napoleon. Okay, so that was horrendous for that system. They'd never known anything like this. They'd always had power to exercise in Europe. But the next verse tells you what was going to happen. Verse 17, "For God hath put in their hearts to fulfil his will, and to agree, and to give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God should be fulfilled. So that's why it's been a couple of hundred years. The papal system suffered greatly, but there had to be time for the European nations who went democratic, the principles of liberty and equality and fraternity. There had to be time for them to realise their dependence upon the papacy, and now that is happening. And it's going to happen big time when this depression comes, okay? So that's why there's been such a long, what we would call delay, because God has to put it in their hearts to give their power unto the beast. What beast? The beast of the sea. See it down there in the picture? The beast of the sea of chapter 13, verses 1 to 10. Okay? Because this is a revival of that system. So the beast of the sea in history had its centre of power here, called the sea, of course, because it's the Mediterranean Sea. The beast of the earth that followed it had the centre of its power in Central Europe, where Charlemagne's empire was. Okay, so there were two phases in history. I want to just take you very quickly through the first one, because it's very important in relation to this subject of the disintegration of the European Union and the formation of what existed in history. Some of you will, of course, have not only seen that chart, but made a study of it. It's not a bad idea to actually get hold of that chart, which has been around for a long time, Christadelphian teaching since 1848, okay, about Nebuchadnezzar's image on the left-hand side, and you'll see that Nebuchadnezzar's image makes a reappearance over here on the right-hand side, right at the end of the days. But you'll also notice that this is the subject of Revelation chapter 17, this woman sitting astride a scarlet-coloured beast. So you see, what we're being told here is there has to be this restoration of what happened in history. Now, I want you just to focus, if you can, on this section of the chart. Now, you'd need binoculars from the back of the hall, so I'm going to actually enlarge it for you. Okay, so we can see a bit more of the detail. And what we have here, of course, is the detail of what we see on the bottom of this chart. So we've got this series of chapters. Revelation 12 is about the Roman world as a pagan system. Then there's a change, isn't there, when Constantine comes to power in 312 AD and turns the Roman world into Christian. By 324, he's in control of the whole empire and moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople. What we have then in chapter 13, in verses 1 to 10, is this creature, the beast of the sea. It's about Rome in development between 493 AD and 800 AD, showing the eclipse of the imperial system, its rejuvenation in the Justinian epoch, 529 through 554, giving papal privileges. Okay? But that's followed, because you see this date 800 AD here, that's followed by the beast of the earth. In 800 AD, on Christmas Day, Charlemagne was crowned as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo III in the Vatican. Where else? Okay, and we ended up with two horns on a lamb-like creature, therefore it's religious, but with a lion-like mouth. Okay, it's about government, it's about control, it's about making decrees. Okay, so what we have here is the beast of the earth. Now, do you notice something strange in this imagery? Did you notice what's behind this lamb-like creature? Well, this one, isn't it? Yes. Are you with me? Come with me to Revelation 13. Just want to show you what that represents. Now, Revelation 13, from verse 11 to the end, is about this beast of the earth. This is the second phase. This is the Holy Roman Empire that began in 800 AD. Okay? What would it do? Well, verse 14 tells us. He deceiveth them that dwell on the earth, the Roman earth, by means of those signs which he had power to do on the side of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and we'll come to that in a minute, and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be. You get the idea? There's repetition of this phrase, the image of the beast. What is that? That's the papacy with political power. Okay? The papacy with political power. That's the beast of the sea. That's what the first 10 verses of this chapter are about. How the Pope got political power in the West. Okay? But then when, of course, this next phase came along, the power shifted to Central Europe under Charlemagne and his successors. And it was that emperor that gave the power to the Pope to rule in the West, to rule in the area that we would call Europe today. Okay, and by 1200 AD, the Pope was the most powerful person on earth, even though there were emperors. He had one emperor crawl up to him into Rome in the winter, like your winter here, and he left him out in the cold for 4 days, just to teach him, I am the one with power. All right, so this empire, this Holy Roman Empire, gave absolute power to the papacy, to the image of the beast. This one here. See, that's why it's behind that lamb-like creature. Got a picture? Okay, a lot more detail could go into that, but I think you can see. Now, I want to focus on the beast of the sea, because this is what we're going to see very shortly re-emerge in the earth. This is what we see happening right now, brothers and sisters. The rise of the beast of the sea. So let's very quickly, and we have to be quick, just run through the content here of the first few verses of Revelation 13. What I'm going to really focus on is what you can see there in the box. So we've got this beast that rises up out of the sea in verse 1, and it has 7 heads and 10 horns, we read in that first verse. 7 heads represents the 7 forms of government that the Roman Empire went through in its history. Okay? The 10 horns represent the barbarian division of the empire over 100 and so years, when the barbarians came in and took up portions and control of the Roman Empire and established their own kingdoms. This is why they can be like 10 kings. They had their own little kingdoms. That's why you read that they had crowns. You see, crowns or diadems on these horns. That's about self-government, isn't it? So they set up their own kingdoms. In verse 2, we have this beast of the sea with the likeness to a leopard, a bear and a lion. Really? That's Daniel chapter 7, isn't it? They're the symbols of Babylon, Medo, Persia and Greece. So this beast, this empire, is going to have the characteristics of all the former empires, because you see in its latter day manifestation, the peoples of all of those 4 empires will be united together under its control. That's what it's telling us. And of course the dragon here is the military power of Rome based in Constantinople that gave, of course, the Bishop of Rome the right to rule in the West. And he gave him a throne or a government. Then we come to verse 3. And we read about one of his heads, the 7 heads. One of these heads is actually wounded to death. Now, the history of this is pretty simple, because Rome had these 7 forms of government. They had the regal, the consular, the dictatorial, the decemviral, the tribunitial, and the imperial. Now, the imperial was the important one. This was the form of Roman government from BC 31 to AD 476. Our Lord Jesus Christ was born during this imperial form of government, during the 6th head of this beast. Okay? But this was wounded to death. It had an apparent wound that should have led to death. It came to an end with the barbarian invasions culminating in Odoacer removing that form of government in AD 476. That's when it came to an end. But it only came to an end for 60 years. Because what happened was, in 493, Gothic rule was imposed on Italy by Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths, who had invaded the empire. Thus, the 7th head of government was formed in Italy. But Gothic rule only went on for 60 years. It didn't last all that long. So what happened then? Well, this 6th head, this imperial form of Roman government, yes, it had been struck down, but it was to revive. Verse 3 tells us it was healed. And the Bishop of Rome induced Justinian, who was the emperor in the east in Constantinople, to invade Italy on his behalf in 535 AD. By 544, the Gothic rule came to an end in Italy, and Constantinople revived the imperial head, but not in Rome, in Ravenna, which was on the other side of the leg of Italy. Rome became a city of the second rank, but what was back was very important to the Bishop of Rome, because what was back was the imperial form of government, and in time, through the decrees of the emperors in the east, he was to become the ruler of the West. He was to rule the nations of Europe. Okay? That's what this is about. And papal rule was to go on for 1260 years from the time of Justinian. And we know that 1260 years is involved because we've got 42 months, and a Jewish month has 30 days. So 42 months is 1260, or 3.5 years. Okay? 1260 years, dated from the decree of Justinian in support of the papacy. Those decrees, the Justinian decretals, were from 529 to 533. You add 1260 to those dates, and you come to 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution, to 1793, to the height of the French Revolution, when Catholicism and the influence of the Pope had been destroyed, not only in France, but in other countries around it as well. Okay? So that is where papal rule came to a sudden end in the events of the French Revolution. And by the way, brothers and sisters and young people, there has not ever been one acquisition of papal power in history that has not terminated exactly 1260 years later. Not one. And the last great acquisition of papal power was 800 AD, and it will also terminate in the year 2060. 2060. That's when that empire will come to an end. It's 42 years away. And a lot of things got to happen in that 42 years, okay? Including our judgment, our preparation, Armageddon, and a whole lot of other stuff, okay? And we're not very far away. Now, just to give you a bit of a feel, and I'm watching the time here, this chart will help, I think, in just summarising what we've just said. But get your bearings straight first. When I say the return of Christ over on the left-hand side of this chart, I'm not meaning the return of Christ to collect you and me, to raise the dead and to take us to judgment. We're not talking about that. That comes well before. I think 10 years before. Time will tell. It comes well before. What we're talking about here is when the earth knows, when the world knows that Christ is in the earth. And that will be, of course, in the events of Armageddon, when he and the saints arrive at the Mount of Olives. Okay? So that's what we mean here by the return of Christ. That's why Armageddon is there, you see. This red line that you're looking at here, this is, as we say, the pattern of Roman Catholic resistance to Christ for 40 years after Armageddon. So, of course, the events of Armageddon will be a heavy blow to Catholicism. They will lose their suitor in the East, just like the Pope lost his in the early 700 ADs, or late 600 ADs, when the Eastern Emperor said, we're going to get rid of our idols. And he said, really? I'm not getting rid of mine. They said, well, you can row your own canoe. So they left him to his own devices, and the Lombards made life very difficult. And in the end, he had to call upon Pepin to save him. And Pepin's son just happened to be Charlemagne. Okay? Another big subject, but you can see how all this worked. Well, same pattern all over again. Lost the suitor in the east in Constantinople, heavy blow, but that's not going to stop them. Because Psalm 2 tells us, why do the nations rage? Why do they collect themselves together? Why are they in so much tumult? They have set themselves, says God, have set themselves against me. For I have, this is verse 6 of Psalm 2, for I have set, past tense, I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. Holy hill of Zion? Yeah. Post-Armageddon. This is the time when Zion's exalted, see? This is when they're in rebellion. This is when they, of course, invoke their doctrine of the Antichrist, in which the minds of far too many folk in our world today are infused with the doctrine of the Antichrist, that there will come this individual who sets himself up as king in Jerusalem, claims to be the king of the Jews, and folk will be deceived by that. So nations will join the papacy. So what's Christ going to do about that? Well, Revelation 14 verse 8 tells us, the 10 years after Armageddon. You say, well, that doesn't tell me that. but the chapter does, okay? And we can demonstrate that. It tells you that 10 years after Armageddon, Rome as a city, as the centre of papal operations, even though it suffered in the great earthquake, will remain the centre of papal operations. Okay? It ceases to be that 10 years after Armageddon. It goes down the gurgler forever. What's the Pope going to do then? Well, that Pope will be dead, of course, unless he's somewhere else. Okay? What's he going to do then? Resort to Central Europe, to Magog. So this is why Ezekiel 39, verse 6 says, I will send a fire upon Magog. That's post-Armageddon, the subject of the previous chapter. Okay? Because this will become the centre of papal rule in Europe. So what are we doing here? Well, we're going through the same phases as history, because the papacy will be destroyed in 2060 along with the empire that supports it. But that's not the end of all Catholics. You're pretty close to Revelation 19. Just switch over to Revelation 19 for me. Revelation 19 and verse 20 is talking about the destruction of the Pope and of the empire that's supporting him through this period of rebellion against the rule of Christ. And verse 20 says, and the beast, and that beast is the revived beast of the earth. I'll point that out in a minute when we get back to chapter 17. And with him the false prophet, that's the Pope, that wrought signs before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast. These, it says in the last sentence, both were cast alive. They're operating. They cast alive into a lake of fire, the symbol for eternal judgment. Okay, but what about the rest? Look at verse 21. And the remnant was slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse. So when you look at this chart, 2060 is the destruction of the papacy and the empire that supports him, but you've still got the Catholics, the people who supported that system. What are you going to do with them? They've been given 2 chances. They've been given 2 opportunities. And that's enough. Can't do anything with these people. That's why it says in 7 verse 11 that the beast, the 4th beast, the creature that represents the Roman Empire, its body is burnt. Utter destruction. Okay? You only get a couple of chances in that era. If you don't take them, you're gone. Okay, that's what we're being told in verse 21. There's a remnant. Now, it does appear as though Christ might not come in 2017. So let's just say, for argument's sake, he was to come in 2018, and let's hope that's true. If he was to come in 2018, there's an 8-year clean-up period. Okay? There's an 8-year clean-up period in Europe. And that vacated land, as Isaiah 34 and 35 tell us, and as Revelation 18 verse 2 tells us, and Revelation 19 verse 17 onwards tells us, will become the possession of displaced nations who have had the common sense to submit to Christ much earlier and not to listen to the Pope. Okay, remember that Revelation 17 quote, verse 12? These kings receive power 1 hour with the beast. Yep, there it is. This is the revival of the beast of the earth. So what we have here, brothers and sisters and young people, is in this early part, prior to Armageddon and after Armageddon, we've got the revival of the beast of the sea. Okay? It's back with us. It's the Pope with enormous political power in Europe. And then when Rome's destroyed, we've got the revival of the beast of the earth in Central Europe. Is this Christadelphian teaching, do you think? Yep, it is. It's Brother Thomas, Eureka, Volume 5, page 279. He talks about the 8th head. This is the head that's revived, the imperial that was the 6th, replaced by the 7th. When the 7th is gone, the 6th is revived, so it's an 8th head. Okay, that's what the language of chapter 17 is. He says the 8th head is the Holy Roman Empire under His Holiness and His Apostolic Majesty. So you've got the Emperor and you've got the Pope forming a conjoint dynasty as symbolised by Daniel's little horn with eyes of a man and mouth of blasphemy. He says the same thing, and he refers to Charlemagne's empire in volume 5, page 199. It's been Christadelphian teaching since the 1860s. Okay? And when you look at the detail, it's telling us something very important. It's telling us that we have to have these beasts that we saw and we read in Daniel 7 here this morning, they have to be back with us in the latter days. A power must arise to take the peoples of these territories, to confederate them together, that the image might stand up complete in the land, to be destroyed by Christ and the saints. And Daniel 11, which we looked at yesterday, verses 11, we read verse 11 about the fourth beast whose body is destroyed. But what about the other beasts? As concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time, or as Brother Thomas points out, during the period of the millennium. So they're absorbed into Israel over the period of the millennium. But the Roman beast is utterly destroyed. So the peoples that inhabit, the eastern area, what we called Persia yesterday, remember? Right across to Pakistan. They're not going to be destroyed. It's the people of Central Europe that will be destroyed. But these other peoples will have an opportunity, at least those who survive, to live out their lives in the kingdom age. So what this has been telling us is very simple, isn't it? In history, the 10 horns were formed by barbarian invasion of this portion of Europe. The border of the Roman Empire, briefly they went up here, got pushed out. The border of the Roman Empire for the bulk of its history was the Rhine, the River Rhine and the River Danube, which runs into the Black Sea. That was their northern border. Okay, that is where these 10 independent nations will be formed prior to Armageddon. And we're watching this happen with the disintegration of the European Union. What will happen, as I said, these northern nations, all of these nations up here are part of the European Union, will hive off, they'll do their own thing, and these southern bankrupt nations will become wholly dependent on the man who sits in the Vatican. And he will make sure that he's got political power. So this Great Depression, which we'll talk about a little bit later on today, God willing, we'll see the revival of the beast of the sea, the fourth beast of Daniel 7 verse 7, and the Babylon the Great of Revelation chapter 17. Now I was going to say a little bit about French politics, and I see John over there looking, I need to finish pretty soon, John. I need to finish pretty soon. Just very quickly run through what's happening here. We've got the metamorphosis of French politics. France stood on its head this year. The right and left wing who have ruled France for decades are out of sight. They're gone. And we've got this Macron, in power in France, and he has, of course, a competitor for power. That competitor for power, she didn't do all that well in the president, but she shouldn't have even been there, right? She shouldn't have even been there as a candidate for president of France. And when the wheels fall off in France, which they will do when this depression comes, the time will come when we'll have the Goma. Brother Thomas in Help Us Israel talks about France being the Goma of Ezekiel 38 and verse 5. Yep, because this woman, Marine Le Pen, the head of the right-wing National Front, which is very right-wing. So this article tells us where she comes from. France has a major far-right Eurosceptic, interesting, and openly pro-Russian party that receives funding from the Kremlin. So what's her policies? Well, apart from getting out of the European Union, which would be, cataclysmic for the European Union, she advocates leaving NATO, International Monetary Fund, limits on immigration, stop these Muslims coming in, and forging what she calls a privileged partnership with Russia. Yeah, you can see where that might be going, eh? She's by far the most popular political figure among right-wing voters in France, and she's garnering support from the left-wing as well. The day will come. We don't know what God has in mind for her, but she's certainly positioned to take France into the Confederacy of Gog. Okay, wonderful things. Germany, by the way, can't even form a government. Can't form a government. I'm not going to go into that. They are in serious financial trouble. If they don't get their act together shortly, they're going to have a worse situation than Greece. Okay, so here's Merkel. Yeah, you can see she's very pensive there. This is her former partner in coalition, Martin Schulz. He doesn't want anything to do with Merkel's party anymore, but he's playing along. And he says, we'll talk to you, but we don't want to form a coalition anymore. But we'll talk to you, but we'll start in mid-January. Okay, they don't have a government. Germany is in trouble. She doesn't want new elections because she knows the right wing will gain on her again. Okay? So she wants to avoid that. And this grand coalition that she's looking for probably won't come to pass. I'll cobble something together eventually, of course, but it's not going to be enough to save Germany from crushing financial ruin. That's what's going to happen. So they're going to be out of the picture. They brought their gold home. Did you know that? They brought their gold home from America. They thought the Americans might steal it, for one, when the Depression comes. And secondly, they're preparing for a disaster. They know it's coming. And the world knows it's coming. These warnings given. Investors are on the Titanic, said Dr. Doom. Jim Rogers, he's got squillions. He formed the Quantum Fund with George Soros. You've heard about George Soros, haven't you? Okay? A 68 trillion biblical collapse. I love their language. Biblical collapse will wipe out millions of Americans. Okay? It's coming, brothers and sisters, and the debts of America are well known. The US owes the rest of the world $20.5 trillion. The American young people owe $1.5 trillion in college debt. Americans have more than 1 million credit card debt, 1 trillion in credit card debt, and more than 1 trillion in auto loans. So they're buying cars on debt. And 73% of Americans die with more than $60,000 owing to others. US consumers now have nearly $13 trillion in personal debt. Far more than in 2007 when the avalanche fell on them. So, yep, we're in the days of Noah and Lot, and I want to talk about that in our exhortation this morning, God willing. And we're going to see how relevant that is to you and me, brothers and sisters, when we have a look and see what the past has produced. This Great Depression of the 1930s is going to be repeated again, and it will bring about another war, just like the first one did. But that will be Armageddon, and we're going to be personally involved in that. So in our exhortation, we'll have a look at what we should be doing in expectation of the return of our Lord Jesus Christ.